Hello, Shwmai, good evening and welcome to this Carlam Cymru live recap session. Yes, we are live. Welcome in. In this session, we are going to be recapping the content that we've been over the last 3 recorded sessions. You can see the topics there on the slide on the screen right now. So in the first session, we looked at 1.1, which is analog data and digital data. Then session 2, we looked at 1.2, storing data digitally. And then the most recent session, session 3, we looked at topic 3.1, which is communication methods. My name is Meredydd Jones, and I'm a teacher of digital technology at Ysgol Maes y Gwendraeth. So in this recap, we're going to fly through the headlines. We're going to look at the main bullet points for each one of those 3 topics. But, you know, if you've got the time and there's anything that I'm talking about tonight that you're not quite sure about, it would be a great idea for you maybe to go back and catch up on those recorded sessions. Okay, let's jump straight in then to 1.1, which is the first topic for the Unit 1 exam, which is analog data and digital data. Right, so first of all, we need to be able to define what is analog data. Okay, so analog data is data that is physically represented. It actually exists in the real world as a physical thing. Most of the time we can see analog data, but sometimes we can't see it, even though it physically exists. An example of that would be sound waves. Sound waves physically exist, although we can't see them. You can see there in that highlighted sentence there, analog data is data that is physically represented. Analog data varies continuously, and it identifies each tone of what is being measured. So we've got some examples there, and you can see in the slide. So our voices, my voice right now is booming out of my voice box, and there are sound waves flying across my room here at home, and they are hitting into the microphone. And what happens after that, we'll be talking about later on, because it obviously gets converted into digital for you to be able to hear me tonight. But it begins as analog, and everything in the real world is analog. Things like the sounds coming from any acoustic instruments. The grooves. So it says there, these notes come from the WJC knowledge organisers. So the lines or gaps on a vinyl record, but I prefer the term grooves. That's what I always called them. So if you've ever seen a vinyl record, an old LP, that's analog data. So the actual sound waves themselves are scratched into the plastic disc in order for them then to be replayed on a record player. Here's a bit of a weird one for you, a shade on a sundial. Now, when I teach this back in my school, nobody knows what a sundial is. So sundial is a kind of ornament that you put in your back garden, and you have to position it correctly, because when the sun hits the sundial, it casts a shadow on a clock on the ground, and that tells you what time it is. Now, what happens when the clocks go forward and back? I'm not quite sure. Maybe you've got to spin your garden around. I'm not sure about that. But that's the final example that WJC gives us, is the shade of a sundial. Okay, then, so what's the opposite? What is digital data? Well, computers can't store analog data. I can't shout into a glass jar to store the sound waves from my voice and put that somehow into a computer. So everything that we want to put into a computer has to be converted into numbers, because that's the only way that computers are able to store anything, is to store them as numbers. And that's where we get the term digital from. Digit is another word for a number. And digital data, when it comes down to it, is a combination of ones and zeros, because we store numbers using a binary number system on computers, which, when it comes all the way down to it, we can boil any number down into ones and zeros. We'll be looking at that a little bit later on. And computers use digital data to represent real world analog data. So examples of this is digital storage of sound. So when you listen to music, That's been stored digitally on whichever device you're listening to it on. Sorry, I'm speaking about digital devices here. So if you're listening to music on your phone, or if you're listening to it wirelessly with AirPods, kind of earphones in, that's being stored digitally, and then it's being converted back into analog right at the last moment before you need to be able to hear it, because we can't listen to ones and zeros. Okay, so what about graphics then? We've spoken a lot about sound there and audio. What about things that we can see? Well, again, in order to store anything visual on a computer, we have to turn it into numbers. Everything has to be turned back into numbers at the end. So what we do with any image that we want to store on a computer is that we basically split that photo up onto a kind of grid. Okay, and then each little square on the grid is called a pixel. And I'm sure you've heard the term pixel before. And then that's all we need to do is give each pixel a number or a coordinate, kind of like map coordinates. And then we need to tell that pixel what color it needs to be. And you can see then, by storing all that in a list, we can recreate any image digitally. You can see there the e-sgol logo. I've zoomed right in on it, and this is what happens when you zoom in on digital images, obviously, is that we get pixelation, because at some point we're going to reach the end of the line. If I kept on zooming in on that, at the end of the day, I would just have one big colored square in the middle of my screen. Okay, this is the opposite of analog data. If I got a microscope, a really powerful microscope, and zoomed in on an oil painting on canvas, something by Cyffin Williams, a famous Welsh artist, if I zoomed in with a powerful microscope on that, I could keep on zooming in forever, and I'm always going to see something new. I'm never going to reach the end of the data. So analog data, it varies continuously. It's never ending. However much you zoom in, you'll always see something new. Digital data, somebody somewhere has decided what the kind of end point is. Okay, how many pixels do we really need this picture to be? But if you keep on zooming in, you're just going to get down to one big colored square. Okay, you're going to reach the end of the data. So if we're then storing colors, one way of storing colors is to use 8-bit color. So 8-bit color would use one whole byte of data in your computer storage. And then doing that allows you to have any one of 256 colors for each pixel. And you can see an example there in the bottom left of a 256 color palette. Now, 256 color palettes, so 8-bit color palettes, work quite well for simple colors, block colors, especially if you think of 2D animations, most 2D cartoons, if you think of things like The Simpsons, Super Ted, they're not going to use any kind of detailed color gradients. So just having a simple color palette like that would be fine. And when I grew up in the 80s and the 90s, most of the computer games, well, all of the computer games that I played, so if you think of retro computer games, they would use, well, right at the beginning, they didn't have any color at all. Let's be honest. But when they did start having color, they would have 8-bit color, because you didn't need any more options than those there. Okay, back to sound again then. So to represent analog sound as digital data, the sampling process is used. So sampling is a really important word here when we're talking about sound and moving from analog to digital sound. The reason for that, of course, is that, like I've said, if we want to store anything digitally, we have to convert it into numbers. So how do we convert sound into numbers? Well, sound, as I discussed right at the beginning of today's session, sound travels in waves. And the way we can measure waves, and I'm sure you've done something similar to this in your science lessons or maybe in maths, is to actually plot it on a graph. So if we've got a nice curved sound wave like that red wave you can see in both of those upper examples on the slide, what we do when we're sampling that is we're doing two things. okay, we are deciding, we're measuring the height of the wave, okay? So that's then the sample resolution. And obviously, the finer we want that gradient to be, then the more data we're using on our computer, okay? But then we can also decide how often we want to measure the sound wave. So this is called the sampling frequency, okay, or the sample rate. So we can decide, okay, do we want to measure the sound wave 10 times a second, 100 times a second, 1,000 times a second? And obviously that then is going to have an effect on how much storage this is going to use up on your computer. But remember, when we're playing these sounds back out from our computer, that's all your computer is going to do, or your device is going to do, is recreate the numbers that have been plotted on the graph or on the grid. So you're not going to hear the nice curved red sound wave back out. You're going to hear whatever's been stored. So as you can see there on the bottom right, you see right in the bottom right there, if we've got a low sample rate and a low sample frequency, then you're going to have that kind of jagged stepped edge going up your sound wave. But then if you increase the resolution and the frequency, the bottom half of it, there you can see right at the bottom right, you've got a smoother curve. But once again, even if you use the highest sampling rate possible with an incredibly high sample frequency, if you zoom in enough on a part of the sound wave you're trying to recreate, you're going to see big angled steps. And what those steps do is they cut corners. Okay, you'll see if you look again at the top left, you can see that the blocks that have been plotted around that red sound wave, they cut corners. They chop some of the original sound wave off sometimes, and then sometimes it kind of adds a bit extra in. And this is basically the kind of digital noise and digital artifacts that we hear. Maybe you're hearing it right now. Okay, maybe my internet connection and your internet connection together aren't that great. And maybe my voice is sounding a little bit robotic. Maybe it's dropping out a bit. And what's happening there is that the app that we're using to do this live stream tonight is deciding that our internet connections aren't very fast. So it's going to have to drop the sample rate and the sample frequency in order for my voice to still be able to travel to you in real time. If my internet connection improves, then the app that we're using tonight, it's just Microsoft Teams, it can decide then, okay, we've got a good internet connection now, let's bump up the sample rate and the sample frequency. Okay, so maybe you're hearing examples of that right now. I obviously I can't tell because in this room here, my voice sounds just like my voice. Okay, but when I watch it back, when I watch the recording back, I'll be able to see and I'll be able to hear maybe digital artifacts in my voice. Okay, so how does it work? How does conversion work? Okay, well, for conversion to work, basically we need two electronic circuits, kind of two computer chips. We need an AD converter and then we need a DA converter. Okay, so we need, first of all, we need an AD converter to convert from analog to digital. So my voice right now is going into this microphone. Now the top part of this microphone is all analog, because a lot of microphones you see, especially one maybe in your school hall, that's just going to be analog. It's just magnetic signals traveling down a wire and coming out of the speakers. Okay, there's no computer involved. But at the bottom of my microphone here, it's actually got a USB cable coming out of it. So USB is a digital cable. So before it's reached this cable, it's already been turned into digital. Okay, so at the bottom of my microphone here, there's actually an AD converter, an analog to digital converter. And what it's doing is right now, as I'm speaking, is it's measuring my sound waves of my voice, and it's sending those measurements down the USB cable into my computer, where it's then being sent super fast over the internet over to you. Okay, so that's how it gets converted from analog to digital. But like I mentioned earlier, we can't hear ones and zeros. Okay, we live in the real world, and the real world is analog. So in order for you to be hearing my voice now, we need another electronic circuit. We need another little computer chip. Okay, and that's called a DA converter. It does the opposite. And a DA converter converts the ones and the zeros. It builds up that graph, builds up that kind of waveform, and then it sends that out as analog sound from your speakers or from your earphones or whatever. Okay, so that's the process of analog digital conversion. If you get a question about analog digital conversion, just bear in mind that WJC seem to have sound audio on their mind when they're talking about that. So although you could speak about a lot of different ways that analog data is converted to digital, the clearest way to speak about it on your exam paper would be to talk about sound. So a microphone, analog sound goes into a microphone. If it's a USB microphone, it has a AD converter built in, which measures the sound. It samples the sound, and that is then stored as ones and zeros on the computer. For us to be able to hear it, the computer then has to send the ones and zeros to a DA converter, a digital analog converter, which builds that sound wave back in order to send it out in an analog way for us to hear. Okay, so we've reached the end of our first topic, our first recap of our first topic. And we've just here got advantages and disadvantages of analog and digital data. Okay, so just the headlines. Analog data, if you know people that maybe you've got friends or family that have a record player, a vinyl record player, and they've got a big LP collection, and those people will usually tell you that analog is best. Best is a difficult word, isn't it? Because best for what? But it's true to say that analog data, especially maybe LPs, vinyl records, they do contain all of the information that was recorded. Okay, when you record sound directly onto a vinyl record, everything is recorded on there. It has the full data. It's got it all. All of the information is there, all the nuance. The disadvantage, of course, of that is that, you know, a massive vinyl LP, which is kind of the size of a dinner plate, will hold about 20 songs. Whereas, you know, if I put the same amount of songs onto the same amount of plastic, sorry, if I put songs on the same amount of plastic, but this plastic now was little memory cards, I'd be able to store tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of songs. Okay, so that's a disadvantage of analog, is that it usually takes up a lot of space. Also, analog data, especially things like records, cassettes, VHS video, they degrade over time. They suffer from interference, electrical interference, and static. Yeah, so there's pros and cons. Digital data then. The advantages of digital data is that we can store much more of it in less physical space. Okay, and it's easier to share. It's easier to share between computers, send to other people, other parts of the world. Disadvantages is that because digital data has been sampled, okay, it's been measured in some way in order to turn something analog into numbers. By that fact, you have to lose data. Somewhere along the line, data has been lost, information has been lost that you'll never get back. Okay, so that's our recap of topic 1.1. So I'll just ask Siwan super quick if we've had any questions yet in the chat.
No questions, Meredith, diolch.
Okay, diolch, Siwan. Everyone's enjoying themselves. Everyone's having a great time. That's why I was making notes frantically. Remember now to ask any questions. And even though we're moving on from 1.1, if you've got any more questions, if you've got any questions about 1.1 at any point during tonight's live session, then just pitch in and ask your questions. Right, 1.2 then is storing data digitally. So we've spoken about how we turn things from our real analog world into ones and zeros, because that's all we can store on computers. So how does that work? Okay, well, computer systems can only store and process binary digits, also known as bits. Okay, so the smallest unit of that we can store data on a computer is a single bit. And a bit is it either stores a 1 or a 0. Okay, so a bit can only be a 1 or a 0. Now, when I first learned this many years ago, I remember being super confused about this. Thinking, why can it only be a 1 or a 0? Okay, and then I had a kind of aha moment when I realized it's not actually a 1 and a 0. Okay, the 1 and the 0 actually just represent on and off. Okay, and the bit is basically like a little switch. Think of a normal basic light switch in your house. That light switch can only be on or off. It can't be neither of them. It can't be nothing. Okay, and it can't be anything except on or off. And that's exactly what a bit is. Because when we store data, when we store files on our computer, we expect to be able to turn the power off to our computers, and then when we turn the power back on, for that data to still be there. Okay, so although we're storing things on a computer, which depends on electricity, we are expecting the things that we've stored on an electrical device to still be there even after we've disconnected it from power. And maybe now's the first time you've actually thought about that and thought, oh yeah, hang on, I never thought about that. Yeah, actually, yeah. So when my phone runs out of battery and it's totally dead, how is it possible that all my stuff is still on it when I get it back charged up? Okay, so computers have to have a system of storing stuff which doesn't require constant power. And that's how they do it. They do it with bits, which are switched on or off. And then when there's no power going into your device, they just stay in that state. It's either on or it's off. And then when there's power back on into your device, then they're still in the same state and everything's back to normal. Maybe have you ever had a power cut in your house before? Okay, so if you've ever had a power cut in your house before, and it's lasted maybe like half an hour or something like that, you'll recognize this. When the power comes back on, every light that was on comes back on. Yeah, it doesn't, right? Okay, we've got power back, right? All the lights are off now. We're gonna have to switch them all back on. The house comes back exactly as you left it. Okay, and that's exactly how bits work. So if they can only store ones and zeros, how can we store more numbers than that? And this is where binary comes in. Okay, and the binary number system. And when we store, when we have 8 bits together in a group, they always come together in a little gang of 8. 8 bits always come in a little gang of 8, and that gang of 8 is called a byte. And bytes are the unit of measurement for all computer storage, all digital storage. Okay, we don't measure stuff in bits because that's too small. We measure them in bytes, and every byte is basically a little group of 8 bits. Now, sometimes, especially in the early days of computing, people would store things using half a byte. And there's a little computer technician joke in here for you. So what do we call half a byte? Half a byte is a nibble. Yes, there it is. That's as good as it gets, guys. And byte is spelled with a Y, and because of that, nibble is also spelled with a Y, as you can see there in that little call out at the bottom left of your slide. So how can we store different numbers on here then? How come we can store bigger numbers than just ones and zeros? Okay. The reason we can do that is that we can decide what each bit represents. Okay, we can say what each switch stands for. All right. So if we say that the first bit stands for the number 1. Okay, so if that is switched off, then we've stored the number 0, and if it's switched on, then we've stored the number 1. Okay, cool. So what should we call the next bit along then? Well, the next bit along, we call this 2. Okay, and by switching the 2 bit on and the 1 bit off, we've stored the number 2. If you switch them both on together, we've switched on 1 and we've switched on 2, so we've stored 3. If we switch them both off, we've stored 0. And this pattern goes on and on. So we double the number each time. So for each next bit, we double the number. And by doing that, we can actually store any whole number from 0. Using 8 bits, we can store any whole number between 0 and 256. Okay, because the first bit will be 1, then 2, and 4, and 8, 16, 32, 64, 128. Okay, so the final bit there would be 128. So if we switched that on and all the others off, we'd store the number 128. If we switched every single one of our bits on, we'd actually have stored 256. It's actually 255, but 0 counts as one of our states. So there's 256 kind of different options there if we count 0 as one of them. Don't worry too much about that. I know it's a bit weird. Right. Okay. So we've learned now then what makes a byte. Okay, so a bit is that one little switch, which is either 1 or 0, which is on or off. 8 of them together in a group is a byte. Half of that is a nibble. Right, now then, the byte is the term now that we use to measure everything else. Okay, so the next one there is kilobyte underneath it. Okay, and a kilobyte is 1024 bytes. So why is that not 1,000 bytes? Well, when we increase storage on a digital device, we always double it. And that's again do with binary, with the binary system. So if we double all the way from 1, if we start on 1 and double every time, we don't actually hit 1,000 bang on. The closest we get to is 1,024. Okay, let's prove it. 1, double 1 is 2, double 2 is 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 256, 512, and double 512 is 1024. Whew. Glad I remembered all of that. So that's why a kilobyte is 1024 bytes. Okay, we can't have 1,000 bytes because we double every time, but you know, we needed a nice kind of unit of measurement. Kilo stands for 1,000, and that was about as close as we can get. Okay, so what then if I've got, what if I have 1024 kilobytes? So a kilobyte is 1,000 bytes. So 1,000,000, what's 1,000,000? 1,000 thousands is a million. Okay, so 1024 kilobytes is called a megabyte. And you can see there, so it's not exactly a million, is it? Because it's 1024 times 1024, which is that horrible number on the right-hand side, 1,048,576. Now, the reason I'm pointing that out is that I've seen an example of this on the example paper where they put that number there and they ask what unit of measure, what unit of data storage is this? Okay, so if you see something that looks like a messy million, you know that's a megabyte. Million, mega, million, mega. Okay, million megabyte. And then it goes up from there. 1024 megabytes is a gigabyte. 1024 gigabytes is a terabyte. Right, and I'm going to pause there for a second because I think we've reached basically the end of what we are used to dealing with in the real world. Okay, if you store a Word document on your computer, that's probably going to be measured in kilobytes. okay, because just text with no images doesn't use much memory at all. If you take a photo on your phone or on your digital camera, that is probably, well, it is definitely going to be measured in megabytes. Okay. If you've got a video file, maybe you've filmed your family holiday or something like that, and you've filmed something and it lasts like 30 seconds or longer, that's probably going to hit gigabytes. And your phone's storage is going to be measured in gigabytes as well. Yeah. So I think mine is something like 128 gigabytes. Okay. And maybe you wonder why 128? Why that is such a weird number. And now you know. Now you know. Okay. It's because storage doubles all the time. So it's 128 gigabytes. Right. So then terabytes. So terabytes are an unit that you've probably come across if you've got something like external hard drive at home. I've got some external hard drives just on the desk next to me here. I won't turn the camera on because it's really messy. But I've got some external hard drives there. And I got one of them is a 10 terabyte drive, 10 terabyte drive. And then I've got a 6 terabyte drive and a 2 terabyte drive. Okay. And I do a lot of video stuff, and I like working with videos and storing videos and that type of thing. So I need terabytes of storage for that. Right, now then, what about these at the bottom then? Well, these, you can see I put a bracket around them and I said, these are very large units. So I think it's less likely that questions on petabytes down to yottabytes are going to turn up, because we don't have any real world experience of using these units of measurement. Okay, but a petabyte is 1024 terabytes, then an exabyte is 1024 petabytes, and then a zettabyte is 1024 exabytes, and then a yottabyte is 1024 zettabytes. And a yottabyte, for you Star Wars fans out there, is named after Yoda, which is cool. Right. On we go. Okay, so when we store things digitally, we usually want to store it using as little memory as possible. Okay, so we then use something called compression to make file sizes smaller. And there are two different ways we can compress digital data. We can compress it using lossless compression, and we can compress using lossy compression. So lossless compression, as you may be able to guess, is compression that makes the file size smaller, but doesn't actually lose any of the information in the original file. Okay, so it kind of uses clever maths and algorithms to store exactly the same data using less space on your computer or on your device. And a really simple example of that is, look at this picture I've got here, this image I've got of one of the bad guys in the Pac-Man game. So this has only got 4 colors. The black squares are actually transparent. Okay, so on this this picture of this bad guy, each pixel can either be transparent, which is shown as black here, red, white, and blue. That's it. Okay, so in the original file, you would go through each pixel, storing the coordinates. So, okay, pixel coordinates 0, 0. So that's the top left square there, top left pixel. And then you'd store a code, a number code for transparent. And then you go to the next pixel, 0, 1, transparent. 0, 2, transparent. So you'd be storing the coordinates of the pixels, and for each one, you'd be storing every time the color code. How could you do that using less space? Well, what we could do is we could just start off with the name of the color and then just list every pixel that needs to be that color. Okay, because then we're only storing the color code for transparent once. We're only storing the color code for red once. So you're going to save a lot of space by doing it that way. Okay. If you needed to paint that picture from both of those files, you would get exactly the same image. But here's what's important as well. The original file, if you're going to have a race and you're going to give two people, one of them gets the original file and 3 coloured pens, and the other person gets the compressed file with 3 coloured pens. The person following the big original file is probably going to be able to paint that faster than the person using the compressed file, because the person using the original file can just go through pixel by pixel. Okay, 0, 0, nothing, 0, 1, nothing, 0, 2, nothing, 0, 3, nothing, 0, 4. Yeah, it's really quick. Whereas the person with the compressed file is going to have to go, right, now then, I've got my red pen. Which pixel do I need to color red? You have to work harder to kind of unpack where all of these colors go. And that's exactly what happens in your computer. Your computer needs to work harder to open and display and work with compressed files compared with original big files. Right. So what's lossy compression then? So that's lossless compression, where we've made the file smaller, but we've kept all of the information intact. Lossy compression, where we literally throw stuff in the bin. Okay, we decide we're going to throw some stuff away. And I think the best example of lossy compression is when we convert sound files from WAV. WAV is kind of the most detailed digital sound file. If you convert from WAV to an MP3, we are crushing that file size down. So you are going from something like 50 megabytes for a song down to 3. Okay, so it's less than 10% of the original size. So how does it do that? Well, it actually does it by throwing some stuff in the bin. You can see there we've got a sound wave at the top, and those dark blue bands, top and bottom, represent frequencies which are too high for us to hear and too low for us to hear. Okay, so I'm sure you're aware there are frequencies that we can't hear, but bats can hear, and they kind of communicate to each other, screaming at each other, but we can't hear it. And in the same way, there are frequencies that are too low for us to hear, like whale song. Whales speak to each other, sing to each other at frequencies which we can't hear. Okay, so when you convert from a WAV file or a WAV file to an MP3, one of the first things that happen is that they just scoop off the high frequencies and the low frequencies. Because the reasoning is, well, nobody can hear it, so what's the big deal? But I'm sure you've been in a concert or you've been somewhere where there's a big sound system, big PA system. And if you hear music being played through a big sound system, you don't just hear the bass over a big sound system. You actually physically feel it. Yeah, you can feel it in your belly. If you were listening to an MP3 file over a big PA system, you'd hear all the low notes that you normally hear, but you wouldn't actually feel that physical low frequency in your belly because it's been scooped off. And the same way, those high frequencies that we can't hear actually make sound and music sound crisper. It gives it more air, makes it sound more airy. So although there aren't actually notes up there that we can hear, it actually gives some clarity and some crispness to the sound files. And that's just scooped off when we use lossy compression. Those two cool frogs at the bottom right, you can see the lossless image on the right-hand side. It's got that cool kind of mist behind the frog's head. And that mist has got a gradient from nearly a white all the way to the black at the edges. And on the right-hand side, that gradient is really smooth. But the lossy image on the left-hand side, you can see, and if you can't see it on this live stream, take a look at the presentation, which is uploaded to the Carlam Cymru website. You'll be able to see that we get this kind of banding where the colours kind of jump from one shade of grey to the next. Okay, and once that's happened, you can't get that original data back. Once you've used lossy compression, that data's gone forever. Okay, You are allowed to take a calculator into this exam, which is weird, but you are, just in case a question comes up on compression ratios. Okay, now these questions usually look like the middle there, e.g. if you look there in the middle of the slide, e.g. if a file with an original size of 100 kilobytes were compressed into a 5 kilobyte file, the compression ratio would be, right, so you need to give the compression ratio. Now, the maths here is pretty simple. You just take the original big number and you divide it by the new small number, okay? So 100 divided by 5 is 20. And then you put that answer, and after it, you just put colon 1, okay? 20 to 1, and it'll always be to 1, okay? So if that comes up, divide the big number by the small number, whatever your answer is, it's that to 1 as a ratio. Okay, secondary storage. This just goes over the different types of storage devices we can use to store digital data. So magnetic are spinning magnetic disks, okay, which are in most hard drives. Solid state is SSD drives or flash drives, which is in SD cards. That's what we've got on all our phones. It's faster. It doesn't heat up as much. It's a bit more robust, but they are super expensive compared to magnetic drives. Cloud storage is basically using the speed of the internet to send stuff we want to save to somewhere else in the world where it gets stored on one of those two above, magnetic or solid state drives. And then finally, optical media is discs, CDs and DVDs. Okay, and CDs and DVDs are basically, they're just plastic discs stored with zeros. And if you want to store ones on there instead of zeros, a laser beam inside the disk drive will actually burn ones onto each little bit of data. And then the same laser beam can read the ones and the zeros back. Okay. Our final topic is the most recent one, which is digital communication methods. Okay. Now, in this topic, really, it's a lot of common sense. Okay. Email. If you get a question about email, just compare it with traditional posting a letter. And if you compare emailing with posting a letter, then we can see that you can send an email to anyone in the world who's got an email address and an internet connection can receive an email. They're much quicker compared to the traditional post. You know, they practically don't say that they arrive instantly. They're not quite instant. They do arrive within seconds. And they can be sent 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. You don't have to wait for the postman to be working. And they are relatively cheap to send. They're very, very, very cheap to send. They're not free because you do have to pay for your internet connection, your device, electricity, etc., etc. Okay, social networking websites and apps. So what do we do on social networking websites and apps? Well, we build social networks. So we get in touch with our friends, family. We make friends with new people who we haven't met in the real world, but they share the same interests as us. People who do the same activities as us, have the same backgrounds as us, and our life connections. I'm sure your folks, like I do, use social media to get back in touch with old school friends that I haven't seen for years. Blogs. What is a blog? Now then, blogs is a bit of a head scratcher for most year 10 and year 11 students. They're not quite sure what to say about it, but basically a blog is just a website which contains an online diary, okay, or kind of articles. And then other people, then your blog visitors can read your posts, look at your photos, watch your videos, your vlogs. Video blogs are called vlogs. And usually they can kind of comment underneath, and you can have a little bit of a social media on your own website, which is called a blog. Instant messaging. So this is where two or more people in real time can send messages, photos, videos, emojis, GIFs, memes, voice notes to each other. It's really informal. And if you get a question on instant messaging, I think you need to bear in mind that WJC have probably got WhatsApp in their mind when they're writing questions on instant messaging. Video conferencing, well, this is what we did during all the lockdowns, isn't it? You know, FaceTime, Zoom, Skype, Microsoft Teams, Google Meet. It's basically a live video meeting between two or more people. And in those, we can transfer sound. You're hearing my voice right now. Video, you can see me right now. Text on the screen, maybe if you've got the chat open, and also presentations, you can see my slides right now. So this, right now, is a perfect example of video conferencing. It would be even better if we could all see each other rather than you just all seeing me jabbering on, okay? But I don't need to explain more about video conferencing because we lived enough of that, didn't we? Okay, so then you need to be able to write about the use of these technologies for personal use and then also for business use. So again, businesses use video conferencing, saves people traveling to the office, sometimes traveling to other countries for meetings. Now that can happen online. Teleworking is just a posh word for remote working or working from home. When I ask my classes to put their hands up, how many of them have got a friend or family member that are now able to work more from home since the lockdowns? Usually about 60% of the classes put their hand up. Okay, so teleworking has changed our lives. It's mainly down to the speed of the internet that we can now do most of our work over the internet from home. Emailing. Now, emailing is the king of business and work. It is it's the most formal form of digital communication. Keeps a track of what you sent, when you sent it to, and yeah, it's definitely the most formal business-like way of communicating. And then businesses also wanted their workers to be able to kind of have chats in the way that you can do on instant messaging apps like WhatsApp without actually getting them to use those apps, because that's where you get kind of inappropriate use of social media. A lot of that's been in the news recently, people getting into trouble for that. So then apps like Slack were created, which is kind of like an instant messaging app for work. Okay, and we get into the end, guys. So finally then we've got promotion. Okay, now you need to be able to speak about how businesses use digital communication methods to promote. Basically, promote is just a posh word for advertise. Okay, advertise or marketing. Advertising, marketing, promotion, they are all the same thing. So you need to be able to speak about how online businesses can use digital communication methods for promotion. And really, there's two ways you can speak about here, and it's through email and through social media. Through email, think about an online shop that you've bought something from sometime ever. Okay, now let's think about the kind of emails that we get from that shop. So after we bought something, we might get a checkup email asking if we're happy with our purchase. Maybe a week afterwards, we'll get an email asking, showing us, hey, people who bought that same t-shirt you bought were interested in these jumpers and hoodies. Okay, so they'll show you things related to what you've bought previously. They'll also just send you an email telling you when some new stuff is in the shop. They'll tell you when the sale is on. Oh, we're going to know when the sales are on, aren't we? In January, we're going to have emails. We're going to have 100 emails a day about sales. If you haven't bought anything from an online shop for a while, they might send you a discount code that you can use in maybe a short window of time. Use this code in the next 3 days to receive 10% off whatever you want to buy. Okay, so there's 5 different types of email, promotion emails you could receive there. And then finally, social media. Social media will advertise to us. Okay, we've got adverts on social media, and they will usually start off by targeting just the kind of social media app that you're on. Okay, if I want to sell double glazing, I am not going to even think about advertising it on TikTok, because the majority of people on TikTok are not old enough to be interested in double glazing. Okay, so I would just think straight away, right, let's put some double glazing adverts on Facebook generally. So there's one way of targeting ads. The second way is when you create a profile on any social media platform, you will give information about yourself. You'll give your location, your age, your gender, maybe a few of your interests. And your social media app will then use that to create a really broad, rough sketch of who you are. And they'll just blast you with some ads that they think you might be interested in. It's the second way. The third way then is that your social media apps are going to track what you do on the apps, what groups you join, what pages you like, what posts you like, what hashtags you respond to, use, follow, etc., which people you follow. And they're going to use that to kind of pinpoint even further what your interests are and market you like that. And then influencers is another one, excuse me. So we all know how influencers work. If I'm selling running trainers on my online shop, I could phone Mr. Joe Wicks up and say, hey, Joe, could you give me a shout out and talk about these new trainers that I've got on sale at the moment? And he'd be like, why would I do that? Sorry, that was a really bad Cockney accent. And maybe I'd have to pay him. Okay, maybe that's what happens. It'd be a brand deal. Maybe I'd have to pay him £1,000 or £10,000. I don't know what influencers charge. And then he would then give a shout out to my shop, give him the link, talking about the trainers. He'd hold one in his hand. He'd probably have to keep those as a little sweetener on the deal. And then all of his followers are interested in keeping fit. So I've now paid him to get a direct channel to loads of people that are interested in the type of thing that I'm selling. Okay, so there are examples for you of promotion via email and social media. Okay, guys, we've reached the end of the live recap for those 3 topics. Now, I've really tried to fly through them. I have gone 5 minutes over, and I really apologize for that. But if you are unsure about anything in those, I strongly urge you to go back, take a look at the recorded sessions where I go through each of those topics in more detail. I'll just pass over to Shua now just to check if we've had any questions in at all.
No questions, Meredith.
Okay, right. Well, there we go then. If there's no questions, thank you for joining me. Thank you to Shuan for keeping an eye on the chat. And hopefully I'll see you on another recorded session and then a live session again in the not too distant future. Thank you very much. Hwyl fawr, nos da.